going to start with the George Washington quote about Instagram, but I couldn't come up with one. So let's just get into it. I'd first like to go over why we believe that the status quo best upholds U.S. strategic interests, and talking about the lack of guarantees under the affirmative team's plan. And then finally, I'd like to close by looking at the progress and potentials within the status quo. I'd like to begin, like I said earlier, by looking at the U.S. strategic interest and what's actually at stake for the United States here. Now, Isaac actually answered this in his last speech by talking about, first of all, human rights, then counterterrorism, and then stopping Russia. So let's examine each of these in turn. Let's begin with human rights. Now, first off, our response to this remains what we have responded to it throughout this speech, that Sudan interests are not United States interests. Now, we recognize as a negative team that we should do all that is possible to prevent human rights abuses, but like we said earlier, the status quo best upholds ensuring that we do not harm the United States and harm human rights, and additionally, that harms in Sudan are not necessarily harms within the United States. Now, these are issues that are within Sudan and within Sudan's economy that the United States does not actually have a stake in. So there is no stake for the United States. Now, secondly, I'd like to look at how specifically how U.S. strategic interests are best upheld by the status quo by looking at the second voting issue, that of no guarantee with affirmative. No guarantee with affirmative. My main point under this is looking at Russia. And this is simply reiterating the points that I brought up in my last speech because the affirmative team has not yet responded to them. There's three main points that I have about the issue of relationships with Russia between Sudan and Russia. And my first point is already relations. As I pointed out in my last speech, Sudan has had a sort of meeting with Russia and argued that they didn't actually like the United States and was showing how they actually supported Russia. So this is something that is happening whether or not we have a SSOT designation or not. Additionally, the affirmative team's own evidence has talked about how Russia is within the Sudan and influencing Sudan. Now, secondly, what is actually stopping Russia from continuing these relationships? And my point under this is nothing stopping. So besides talking about how there are already relationships, affirmative team's plan does nothing to actually stop continued relationships. And this is a point that the affirmative team has yet to respond to, pointing out how actually removing Sudan from the SSOT list will provide for their advantages of stopping Russian interference. Now, then going on from that, my third point, besides that the fact that it's already happening and there's nothing stopping it under the affirmative team's plan, is why is this actually harmful? Now, when I asked the affirmative team to prove what U.S. strategic interests are, they said that one of them was to stop Russian influence. Now, why should we uphold stopping Russian influence? And their reasoning was because that's for U.S. strategic interests. And then we asked, what are U.S. strategic interests? And they said stopping Russia. There's a little bit of circular reasoning going around here showing how actually U.S. strategic interests aren't necessarily for stopping Russia. We pointed out several important criteria for U.S. strategic interests, including upholding U.S. credibility and United States well-being, ensuring the well-being of the United States besides upholding human rights. And these are things that we believe the status quo better maintains than the affirmative team. Now, the next point that I'd like to bring up is voting issue 3, progress and potential. Besides U.S. strategic interests as my first voting issue, and then secondly, no guarantee with affirmative, my third voting issue is that of progress and potential. These are points that the affirmative team again has not responded to, talking about how under the status quo, sanctions were removed from Russia once they complied with benchmarks, and then finally, the designation will be removed when they continue to comply with these benchmarks and make further progress. And so we see the progress that has happened in the past and the potential for continued progress. Now, it seems here that the affirmative and the status quo is at a stalemate. See, both of them argue that we uphold U.S. strategic interests, and both of us want to improve U.S. strategic interests. But on the other hand, the status quo provides an advantage that the affirmative team has not actually upheld, and that is not endorsing corruption. The disadvantage to the affirmative team's plan is that it does actually endorse corruption. Now, when we look at this case, it's a little bit like saying a mom saying to a kid, you can't have cookies. The kid keeps having cookies and eating cookies, and so the mom takes away the rule. Now, in this case, this is a little bit of corruption on behalf of the kid on behalf of the kid still actually eating the cookies. And in this case, the United States is actually endorsing corruption on behalf of Sudan by allowing them to continue. And so we can see that this actually harms United States credibility. Ultimately, the affirmative team's plan harms U.S. strategic interests, but the status quo maintains U.S. strategic interests. That's why I ask you to vote for the negative team. Thank you.